3 days after I left Fort Bragg's military hospital with my newborn twins, my husband walked into our kitchen with his arm around his wealthy boss, tossed divorce papers on the table, smirked, and told me to sign. I was a lieutenant colonel with 14 years of classified service, a pension worth $210,000, and he called me a secretary in front of his mother. If you're watching this from a base, a hospital, or a courtroom parking lot right now, comment where you are, hit like, and subscribe, because what happened at that custody hearing 11 weeks later is the reason I don't apologize for being underestimated anymore. My name is Colonel Renata Ashworth, and on the morning my daughters were 3 days old, my marriage ended over a kitchen table that still had my hospital discharge papers on it. Loop 1 started that same week when my husband's attorney filed for full custody, citing my deployment history as proof I was, in his words, an unfit and largely absent mother. Loop 2 had actually started 6 years earlier, the night my mother-in-law told her bridge club that I did paperwork at a desk in Germany while my husband built his real estate empire alone. A lie he never corrected, not once, in 6 years of dinners where I sat silent. Loop 3 was the sealed manila envelope sitting in my lawyer's safe, marked classified, declassification pending, containing exactly what I did in Kandahar province in 2019, a file that would not be opened for anyone until the day it mattered most. The twins were named Grace and Eleanor, 6 pounds 2 ounces and 5 pounds 13 ounces, born by emergency cesarean at Womack Army Medical Center after 31 hours of labor that started while I was still finishing out processing paperwork for my retirement. My husband, Marcus Whitfield, was 38 years old, a commercial real estate developer worth, by his own estimate, $4 million. Though I would later learn in discovery that most of that was leveraged debt against properties he didn't fully own. He met me at a fundraiser in 2015 when I was a major stationed at Bragg, and for the first 18 months, he introduced me at parties as, "My wife, she's in logistics," which was technically true and completely, deliberately incomplete. By the time I made lieutenant colonel, Marcus had stopped introducing me at all. He would let his boss, a developer named Gerald Kovac, who signed his checks and, I would later learn, signed several other things in Marcus's life, do the talking. Gerald was 51, twice divorced, and had the specific habit of resting his hand on my husband's shoulder in a way that told the whole room who actually owned the relationship in that marriage. My mother-in-law, Diane Whitfield, 64 years old, a retired school administrator from Charlotte, had one fixed belief she repeated at every holiday: that women who played soldier were compensating for something, and that her son had married beneath his potential. She said it at Thanksgiving in 2020, she said it at my own baby shower in 2024, standing over the onesies, looking at my dress uniform photo on the mantle and saying, loud enough for the room, "She was never really a soldier, you know, just paperwork, secretarial work mostly." Nobody corrected her, not even Marcus, who knew because he had seen my personnel file once, years ago, and quietly closed the folder without reading past the cover page. What none of them knew, what I had never told a single member of that family in 9 years of marriage, was what those deployments actually were. I served 2 tours with a female engagement team attached to a joint special operations task force, embedded with an intelligence cell that debriefed high-value detainees and coordinated medevac logistics for operations that still don't have public after-action reports. I have a Bronze Star with Valor device sitting in a drawer in Fayetteville that Marcus has seen exactly once, the day it arrived in the mail, and asked me if it was like a participation thing. I laughed it off then. I have never laughed about it since. The pregnancy itself had been high risk from month 5, a condition called twin-to-twin transfusion syndrome that required 2 separate hospital admissions and a specialist flown in from Duke. Marcus visited twice in 11 weeks. Gerald's company jet, I learned later, was in the air to Aspen both of those weekends, and Marcus was on it the other 9. I labored alone with my sister, Captain Dana Ashworth, an Army nurse stationed at Bragg, holding my hand and counting contractions on her watch, a battered Casio she'd worn through 2 deployments of her own. When the babies came out screaming and pink and perfect at 4:17 in the morning on a Tuesday in April, Marcus was asleep in a hotel room 40 minutes away. He arrived at 9 a.m. with coffee for himself and nothing for me, and told the nurse, within my hearing, that he needed to be back in the city by noon. 3 days later, discharged with 2 infants, a catheter bruise still healing on my hand, and a body that hadn't slept more than 90 consecutive minutes since Sunday, I came home to find Gerald Kovac's Range Rover already parked in our driveway. That was the first sign. The second was the manila folder sitting square in the center of the kitchen table, next to a pen Marcus had clearly set out in advance, like he'd rehearsed the placement. Diane was already there too, arms crossed, wearing the expression she reserved for people she considered beneath correcting. Marcus didn't sit down. He stood with his hand on Gerald's forearm, not Gerald's hand on his shoulder this time, but the reverse, like he needed the older man's permission to say what came next. "I want a divorce," he said. "Full custody. You're not stable enough for this, Renata, and we both know it." Diane didn't wait for my response. She said the twins would be better off somewhere normal, and that I should take my things and go before the girls got attached to a house that was never really mine anyway, since Marcus's name alone was on the deed. Then she said the sentence that would follow me for the next 11 weeks. "Take your babies and get out. You were never a soldier in this family. You were staff." I remember the specific sound the front door made, a soft click, no slam, because I refused to give any of them the satisfaction of a scene. I remember the cold hitting my face first, then my hands, because I had walked out without a coat, carrying Grace in one arm and Eleanor strapped to my chest, snow already collecting on the porch steps in a freak April storm that the local news would later call the latest snowfall in county history. I remember my sister Dana pulling up 4 minutes later. I had called her from the driveway, my voice flat, no tears, just coordinates, like a 9-line medevac request. "I need extraction," I told her. "2 dependents, non-ambulatory, exposure risk." She didn't ask questions. She just said, "Copy," and she was there before I'd finished counting my own breathing. That was Loop A, opening in full. The divorce filing came 4 days later, and the custody petition named my history of extended absences due to military obligations as grounds for unfitness, drafted by an attorney named Harold Bell, 62 years old, a man who had handled every Whitfield family legal matter since 1998, and who liked to remind judges, unprompted, that he'd argued in front of the Fourth Circuit. Loop B, the personal betrayal, deepened that same week, when I discovered, through a bank alert Marcus had forgotten I still had access to on our joint account, a wire transfer of $18,000 to a woman named Vanessa Rios, a name I did not recognize, 3 weeks before my due date. And Loop C, the reckoning, began quietly, almost invisibly, when my old commanding officer, Brigadier General Thomas Halloway, retired, called my cell phone the night I left the house, and said 4 words I would hold on to for the entire winter that followed. I heard, "Sit tight." We stayed with Dana for the first 6 weeks, in a 2-bedroom rental off-post with a radiator that clanked all night, and a crib we assembled at 2 a.m. using a headlamp because the overhead light had burned out. I nursed twins in shifts, slept in fragments, and every morning at 0600, out of habit 14 years deep, I made my bed anyway, tight corners and all, in a house that wasn't mine, because it was the only thing that still felt like mine to control. Harold Bell's office sent a formal letter within days, citing my unpredictable operational tempo as a threat to the children's stability. language so absurd I had, in fact, just retired, with 0 deployments pending, that my own attorney, a woman named Priya Chandrasekaran, laughed out loud reading it in her office. Priya was 39, a former Army JAG officer who had left active duty to build a family law practice specifically for military spouses being steamrolled in civilian courts by men who assumed uniforms meant absence and instability. She had handled 11 cases like mine in 6 years. She had lost exactly 0. "They're going to underestimate you the whole way through," Priya told me, sliding a legal pad across her desk at our first real meeting. "That's not a weakness, Renata. That's the entire strategy. Let them." She asked about my service record, and I gave her the sanitized civilian version: logistics coordination, personnel management, until she stopped me, looked me directly in the eye, and said, "I need the real file, not the version you give people at parties." I told her some of it was classified, sealed under a review that wouldn't complete for months. She didn't blink. She picked up her phone right there and called a contact at the Pentagon she'd worked with during her JAG years, a colonel named Whitmore, who owed her a favor from a case in 2019. That call was the envelope being placed on the table. Loop A's mechanism, quiet, procedural, and utterly devastating in slow motion. A formal request for expedited declassification review, tied to active custody litigation, filed that same week. Diane called twice during those 6 weeks, not to ask about the twins, but to ask when I would be moving on so Marcus can grieve properly, as though he were the one who'd been left standing in the snow. The second call, she mentioned, almost as an aside, almost cruelly casual, that Marcus had been seeing someone for a good while now, someone from Gerald's office, someone who understood real business, unlike me. I wrote the name down after I hung up: Vanessa Rios. Same name from the wire transfer. I didn't cry. I opened a new folder in my email, titled it simply Exhibit, and forwarded the bank alert into it. If you've ever had someone rewrite your worst month into a story where you're the villain, hit like right now and subscribe, because I promise you, the woman who opens folders quietly is always more dangerous than the one who screams. Gerald Kovac started showing up at custody exchanges, which Priya said in 11 years of practice she'd never seen a boss do unless there was more entangled than a paycheck. He'd wait in the Range Rover, engine running, phone to his ear, watching me hand Grace's diaper bag to Marcus in a parking lot with the exact posture of a man supervising an employee, not observing a father. Twice he made comments to Marcus loud enough for me to hear. "Handle it faster this time." And once, when I was 30 feet away buckling Eleanor into her car seat, I heard him say the sentence that confirmed everything Priya suspected. "The Rios girl isn't going anywhere, Marcus, so get the paperwork closed." I recorded nothing. I didn't need to. Priya subpoenaed Gerald's company calendar 3 weeks later, and it told its own story in dates and flight logs. Vanessa Rios, I would eventually learn from Discovery, was 26 years old, a junior associate at Gerald's firm, and had been receiving payments from a shell account tied to Marcus's development company since 8 months before my due date. Payments structured just under reporting thresholds, 11 of them, totaling $94,000. Marcus had been bleeding our marital assets to fund an affair, while simultaneously arguing, in his custody filing, that I was financially unfit to raise our daughters because my military pension was unpredictable. Priya highlighted that line in yellow and said, dry as gravel, "We're going to enjoy this part." Harold Bell, meanwhile, kept building his case around the same 3 words, court filing after court filing. Unstable, unpredictable, absent. He deposed me for 6 hours in July, twins home with Dana, and asked me, verbatim, whether I had ever actually seen combat, or was that more of an administrative designation? Priya objected 11 times in that deposition. I answered every question in the same flat, even tone I'd used briefing colonels. No anger, no rise in pitch, just facts delivered like coordinates. Harold smiled through most of it, the specific, closed-mouth smile of a man who believes he already knows how a story ends. He asked about my office assignments in Kandahar. I said, "That information is under active declassification review relevant to this proceeding, and I've been advised not to characterize it further at this time." He wrote something down and moved on, satisfied, certain he'd caught me hiding something small and embarrassing. Diane's second fixed appearance came at a supervised visitation handoff in September, when she showed up uninvited to observe, standing behind Marcus with her arms crossed, in the same posture from the kitchen table 5 months earlier. She looked at Eleanor, then at me, and said, to no one in particular, but clearly for my benefit, "It's a shame the girls won't remember a mother who was never really present in the first place." I knelt down, zipped Grace's jacket against the September wind, and said nothing. I had learned, across 14 years and 2 combat deployments, that the coldest room in any negotiation is the one where you refuse to hand someone the reaction they came for. Dana, standing beside me, gripped my arm hard enough to leave a mark, not to stop me, to steady herself. General Holloway called again in October. He'd read the declassification request Priya's contact had escalated, and he told me, in the clipped voice I remembered from briefings in 2019, that he intended to submit a sworn declaration to the court himself if the case went to hearing, detailing exactly what my administrative designation in Kandahar had actually been. "They want to call you a secretary," he said. "I was there, Colonel. I'll tell the court what a secretary doesn't do." The cruelest part of Loop B didn't come from Marcus directly. It came in November, 6 days before the hearing, when Vanessa Rios herself sent me a message on social media. Not an apology, not even close, but a warning dressed as courtesy. She wrote that Marcus had told her I would probably lose the girls anyway, once the court saw my deployment gaps, and that she wanted me to know she and Marcus were already looking at a townhouse near Gerald's office, 3 bedrooms, for when the custody thing settles. Attached, whether she meant to send it or not, was a screenshot of a text from Marcus, sent the same week Grace and Eleanor were born, that read, "Kids are basically Renata's project. I've got bigger things happening with G." I read that sentence standing in Dana's kitchen at 11 at night, both girls finally asleep, and for the first time since the snow, I sat down on the cold tile floor and let myself feel exactly how much it costs to be underestimated by someone who had once promised, in a church, in front of 100 people, to notice me. I forwarded the screenshot to Priya without a single word of commentary. She replied 9 minutes later, "This is the whole case, Renata. This is everything." Marcus's own words, 3 days postpartum, calling his newborn daughters a project and his affair his real life, time-stamped, unambiguous, admissible. Harold Bell would spend the next 6 days trying to get it excluded as improperly obtained. He would fail because Vanessa herself, subpoenaed and terrified of her own exposure in the financial discovery, would authenticate the message under oath rather than risk perjury charges stacked on top of everything else. I didn't tell Marcus I had it. I let him walk into that courtroom on the morning of November 19th, still believing the story he'd built. Reckless soldier wife, absent mother, unstable pension, a woman who could be managed the way he managed a closing. He wore a navy suit and the same smirk from the kitchen table. Diane sat behind him in the gallery in a cream coat, already composing, I imagine, the version of this story she planned to tell her bridge club by Friday. Gerald sat 2 rows back, arms crossed, watching his investment. I remember the exact texture of the courtroom that morning. The county courthouse in Cumberland, built in 1974, its air conditioning permanently stuck 2 degrees too cold. the specific low hum of the fluorescent panel above the jury box that had needed replacing for at least a year. I wore my Class A uniform for the first time since my retirement ceremony, ribbons in order, insignia polished the night before at Dana's kitchen table, while the twins slept in their bouncers 6 feet away. Priya had advised against it at first, worried it might read as theatrical. I told her I wasn't wearing it for theater. I was wearing it because for 6 years I had let this family decide what that uniform meant, and I was done outsourcing the definition. Judge Miriam Castellanos presided, 56 years old, a former prosecutor known in 3 counties for a reputation of zero patience for procedural games, and even less for parties who wasted the court's time with unsupported character attacks. She opened the hearing by noting, dryly, that she'd read the filings twice and found Mr. Bell's repeated characterization of the respondent's military service as administrative curious, given that the respondent's personnel file, filed under seal pending review, indicated otherwise. Harold Bell adjusted his tie. It was the first time in the entire proceeding I saw him look less than entirely certain. Harold Bell called Diane to the stand first, hoping her testimony about my absent, unstable presence would set the tone. She testified for 18 minutes, repeating almost verbatim the sentence she'd said in my kitchen and again at the September handoff, that I had never really been a soldier in this family, just paperwork, secretarial work mostly. Delivered with the same tight, satisfied certainty she'd worn for 9 years. Priya didn't cross-examine her on the substance. She asked exactly one question. "Mrs. Whitfield, have you ever read your daughter-in-law's DD 214 or personnel file?" Diane said no, she'd never needed to. Priya said she had no further questions and let the admissions sit in the room like a held breath. Then Priya called General Thomas Holloway, retired, 31 years of service, 2 silver stars, to the stand. He walked in wearing his own dress uniform, unprompted, and the entire gallery shifted in their seats at the sight of a man whose reputation preceded him into rooms like this. He was sworn in, and Priya asked him to describe, to the extent the court's protective order allowed, the nature of Colonel Ashworth's service in 2019. Holloway looked directly at Marcus, then at Diane, then finally at me and said, "Colonel Ashworth ran intelligence coordination for a joint special operations task force under my command. She debriefed high-value detainees personally. She coordinated 11 medevac operations under direct fire, one of which saved my communications sergeant's life after an IED strike outside Kandahar. I put her in for a Bronze Star with Valor myself. She earned it lying in a ditch, not filing paperwork behind a desk." The courtroom went silent enough that I could hear the fluorescent light humming again. Priya then moved to admit the declassification packet, the envelope finally opened, that had been sitting sealed in her office safe since July. Judge Castellanos read the cover memo herself before allowing it into the record, her eyebrows lifting slightly at the letterhead. The unsealed portions confirmed what Holloway had testified to and added detail even I hadn't spoken aloud in years. A citation describing how then Major Ashworth had continued coordinating a casualty evacuation for 40 extra minutes after taking shrapnel to her left forearm, refusing treatment until the last wounded soldier was airborne. Judge Castellanos read the final line of the citation into the record herself, in a flat, deliberate voice clearly meant to be heard by everyone in that gallery. Major Ashworth's actions on that date reflect extraordinary courage under fire and are wholly inconsistent with any characterization of her military occupational specialty as clerical or administrative in nature. She looked up, directly at Harold Bell, and said, "Counsel, I trust that resolves the court's confusion about your client's repeated characterization of the respondent's service record. Marcus's face had gone the color of the courtroom walls. Diane's hand had come up to her mouth and stayed there. Gerald, 2 rows back, had gone very still in the specific way of a man calculating exposure. Priya wasn't finished. She moved next to Loop A and Loop B together, entering into evidence the shell account payments to Vanessa Rios, the 11 structured transfers totaling $94,000 in marital assets, and finally, the text message. Kids are basically Renata's project. I've got bigger things happening with G. She read it aloud, once, in the same even tone the judge had used for the citation, and let it sit in the room exactly as long as it needed to. Judge Castellanos asked Marcus directly, under oath, whether he had authored that message 3 days after his daughter's birth. He said, quietly, that he had. The reaction in the gallery moved through the room like a current. A cluster of veterans Holloway had brought with him, 3 of them still active duty, sat straighter with every line the judge read, one of them, a young sergeant, wiping his eyes without embarrassment. A reporter from the local paper, there for an unrelated case, started taking notes she clearly hadn't planned on taking. Harold Bell asked for a recess. Judge Castellanos denied it, said the court had heard enough for one morning and intended to rule from the bench rather than let this drag into a second hearing date. She addressed custody first, awarding me full physical custody with supervised, limited visitation for Marcus pending a parenting evaluation, citing the financial concealment and the documented pattern of disparaging the children's primary caregiver as directly relevant to the children's welfare. Then she turned to the pension dispute Harold had also filed, attempting to claim a portion of my military retirement as marital property, subject to division despite Marcus's own concealed assets, and she denied it outright, noting for the record that the court found the attempt, given the evidence just admitted, to reflect exactly the same pattern of undervaluing the respondent's contributions that had characterized this entire proceeding. Diane stood up before the judge had finished speaking, said something under her breath I didn't fully catch, and Judge Castellanos told her, without raising her voice at all, that she was welcome to remain seated and silent or welcome to leave the courtroom. But those were the only 2 options available to her. Diane sat back down. It was the first time in 9 years I had ever seen her comply with anything. Outside the courtroom doors afterward, in the marble hallway that still smelled faintly of floor wax and old radiator heat, one of the young veterans Holloway had brought with him stopped me, still in his dress blues, and simply said, "Ma'am, thank you very much for your service, truly." The way strangers say it in airports, except this time it landed differently, because for the first time in years, someone was saying it having just heard, in full, exactly what that service had cost. The weeks after the hearing unfolded exactly the way I imagine Priya had quietly predicted from the start, though she never said so out loud, not once, because she wasn't the type to gloat over a ruling she'd earned through evidence rather than luck. Gerald Kovac's real estate firm placed him on unpaid leave 9 days after the hearing transcript became part of the public record, once 2 other female associates came forward separately with their own complaints about his conduct. Complaints that had apparently been sitting quietly in an HR file for years, waiting for exactly the kind of public scrutiny this case had accidentally provided. Marcus lost his position at the firm entirely by January, not because Gerald fired him out of loyalty broken, but because the shell account transfers triggered an internal audit that exposed a pattern of misused development funds stretching back 2 years, unrelated to Vanessa Rios, but discovered because of her. He was, last I heard through mutual acquaintances I no longer speak to directly, working in a mid-level sales role in Charlotte, paying the court-ordered support 11 days late almost every single month. Vanessa Rios was quietly let go from Gerald's firm in December. her name attached in local gossip circles to the scandal in a way she clearly hadn't anticipated when she sent me that screenshot meant as intimidation. I heard she moved to Atlanta. I don't know more than that, and I've made peace with not knowing. Diane Whitfield stopped attending her bridge club by February. Not officially, not with any announcement, but two of the women there were military spouses themselves, and word travels fast in circles built on Thanksgiving gossip. She requested supervised visitation with the twins in March, through Priya's office, formally, in writing, something she had never once done in 9 years of assuming access was simply owed to her by blood. I granted one visit. She arrived early, sat on the floor with Grace and Eleanor, and said, quietly, before she left, that she was sorry. Not for the custody fight specifically, but for the sentence in my kitchen, the one about taking my babies and getting out. She said she'd looked up my Bronze Star citation online after the hearing, that the county paper had run a piece on it, and that she hadn't been able to stop thinking about the 40 minutes I'd stayed under fire coordinating that evacuation with shrapnel still in my arm. I told her I appreciated her saying so. I did not tell her it changed 9 years. Some debts you can only partially repay, and I've learned to let partial be enough when it's honest. Marcus asked to see me once, in March, at a coffee shop near Priya's office, and apologized in a way that felt more rehearsed than Diane's had, though I believe some fraction of it was real. He said he'd built his whole sense of himself around being the impressive one in the relationship, and that admitting what my career actually was would have meant admitting his own felt smaller by comparison. A fear he said he never examined until a judge read a Bronze Star citation into open court in front of people he respected. I told him that fear was his to carry, not mine to fix, and that the girls would grow up knowing exactly who their mother was, in full, without anyone's permission required. I still make my bed every morning at 600, tight corners, out of habit 14 years deep, in a house that is finally entirely mine. Grace and Eleanor turn 1 next week. I think, more than anything, this whole year taught me that the people who call your sacrifice invisible are usually the ones who never once bothered to look directly at it. What would you have done, sitting in that snow, if you'd known the truth was already sealed in an envelope, waiting for exactly the right room to be opened in? There's a detail I never told Priya, never told Holloway, never told anyone until now. The night before the hearing, I sat at Dana's kitchen table, long after the twins were asleep, uniform pressed and hanging on the closet door, and I read my own personnel file front to back for the first time in years. Not the sanitized summary I gave at parties, but the full record, page after page of operation names and dates I'd spent a decade compressing into the single word logistics, because it was easier than watching people's eyes glaze over, or worse, watching them decide I was exaggerating. I found the entry from the night of the IED strike, the one Holloway would later describe from the stand, and I remembered the actual sound of it. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just a flat, concussive thud that rearranged the air. Then the specific metallic taste of adrenaline in the back of my throat. Then 40 minutes of radio traffic where my own voice sounded steadier than I felt, because steady was the only thing that kept a 19-year-old sergeant breathing until the helicopter came. I closed the file around midnight, put it back in its folder, and thought about how strange it was that the people who claimed to know me best had never once asked to read it. I thought about the hospital too, that specific fluorescent hallway at Womack, the smell of antiseptic mixed with the coffee from the vending machine outside the NICU, the sound of the monitor tracking Eleanor's oxygen levels through her first rough night, my hand pressed flat against the incubator glass because I wasn't allowed to hold her yet. Marcus wasn't there for that hour either. Dana was, still in scrubs from her own shift, reciting vital sign ranges to me like a briefing, because she knew that was the language that would actually calm me down faster than any soft reassurance could. I remember thinking, somewhere around 3 a.m., that I had survived combat deployments on less sleep than this, and somehow this felt harder, because at least in a war zone, everyone around me understood exactly what was at stake. By the time the twins are old enough to ask me what I did in the Army, I won't reach for the word logistics. I'll tell them the truth, in language they can hold on to, that their mother stayed when staying was the hardest and least visible thing a person could do, in a hospital hallway, in a courtroom, and in a war zone 8,000 miles from home, and that none of those rooms required an audience to matter. Priya told me afterward, over coffee in her office, with the twins' car seats parked between us, that the case had changed how she opens every new client meeting now. She said she used to ask spouses to describe their marriage first. Now she asks them to bring their DD-214, their evaluations, their citations, before anything else, because in her words, the paperwork tells you who actually did the work, and it's rarely the person who talks about it the loudest at dinner parties. She said Harold Bell had called her office in December, not to apologize, but to ask, almost professionally curious, how she'd known to push for expedited declassification back in July, months before the affair evidence even surfaced. I told her the honest answer myself, later, when she relayed the question to me. I hadn't known the affair was coming. I had simply learned, a long time ago, in a country far from that courtroom, that the truth eventually gets read into the record, whether you fight for it or not. And the only real choice is whether you're the one holding the file when it happens. Holloway sent a card in December, handwritten, no return address, just 3 lines. Proud of you then, proud of you now. The Army doesn't forget its own, even when families do. I keep it in the same drawer as the Bronze Star, which sits, these days, not hidden, but simply present, on a shelf in the living room where Grace and Eleanor will grow up walking past it every single day without ever once having to wonder what their mother actually did, or whether it counted. Dana still keeps that battered Casio watch on her wrist, the one she used to count my contractions, and she jokes that it's the only piece of family jewelry either of us actually values, though it isn't really a joke. She was the only person in this entire story who never once needed a courtroom, a sealed file, or a general's testimony to know exactly who I was. Some people require evidence to see clearly. Others just show up in the snow with a car already running. I told you at the start that I don't apologize for being underestimated anymore, and I meant it. But there's a second story sitting right behind this one that I haven't told you yet. The one about the woman who sat 2 rows behind Diane that morning in November, taking notes she wasn't supposed to be taking. The reporter whose article about my Bronze Star ended up on a general's desk in the Pentagon and reopened a promotion review I'd been told years earlier would never happen for someone with my particular record. That story starts with a phone call I got in January, and it ends somewhere I never expected to stand again. You've already watched this whole story. Comment where you're watching from, and if you've made it this far, you already know you're going to hit subscribe before that next video even finishes loading. So go ahead and do it now, because you and I both know you weren't going anywhere.